If you follow the dialogue of the gospel very carefully, you'll see that Jesus has a very strange comeback to Peter's response. He's asking who the crowds are saying that he is. John the Baptist, Elijah, some great prophet. And who do you say that I am? What's your response to them when they claim that I'm this one and this one and that one? And Peter said, I say you're the Christ. Now that's the right answer, but did you notice that Jesus' response is a word of rebuke? Now, just so we get the context of the word properly, I wrote down the definition. It says in the dictionary that rebuke means is a sharp, stern word of disapproval or reprimand. Why would Jesus reprimand Peter for giving the right answer? Well, because although Peter had the right answer, he, along with the other disciples, had the wrong understanding of what it meant to be the Christ. Their thinking, their understanding of the Messianic king that was coming was someone who was going to free them from Roman tyranny. That he was going to bring pain and suffering upon them to release them from slavery. And so he rebukes the disciples and says, be careful what you do with that kind of thinking. That kind of thinking is going to lead people astray. Because if you teach from those thoughts, you're going to be teaching wrongly. And then he corrects them by telling them what it means to be the Christ. No, Peter, I'm not going to bring pain and suffering on the Romans. I'm going to take pain and suffering and bring it upon myself. And I'm going to free them, and you too, by rising on the third day. What does it take to belong? Well, the reading said, we all belong to Christ because we've been baptized into Christ. What does it take to belong? I'm going to read you some names. And then you tell me if you recognize these names. Bill Baker, Dave Christian, Mike Ramsey, Bob Suter, Jim Craig, Neil Broughton, Mark Johnson, Rob McClanahan. Recognize any of these names? No? Mike Rusioni, you recognize that name? The 1980 Olympic hockey team. Remember those guys? Huh? How many of you saw the movie Miracle on Ice? See, all these guys, okay, were superstars in their own right. All collegiate athletes, all of them excellent hockey players. And so they were all brought together. And so at the first practice, Herb Brooks lined them all up on the blue line and said, now skate. And of course, you know, the problem with being really, really good at what you do sometimes is that you can develop a real big ego. And sometimes we develop egos bigger than Rochester. And so right off the bat, when the whistle blew, off they took off. And some of them were faster than others. And so Brooks, when they got to the other end, Brooks said, again. They came back, again, again, again. Over 2.5 hours, he made them skate back and forth, back back and forth, until they were so tired, they were so sweaty, they couldn't understand what they were doing and why they were doing what they were doing, until one of them figured it out. You see, up until that point, they'd all been acting individually on their own. And the coach wanted them to learn what it meant to skate as a team. And so, when they finally realized what was going on, they slowed it down and they all skated together. And practice ended. You see, those guys might have been good hockey players, but individually, not one of them was going to win any games. If any games were going to be won, they were going to have to be won together as a team. So what did it take to belong to the 1980 Olympic hockey team? There was no room for superstars. There was only room for team players. And that's what Jesus is telling us this morning in the gospel. That if we think we're going to do it alone, on our own, he said, you're not going to make it. You have to follow me. You have to follow me. I want to tell you a story. And the story is about a book. It's a true story. The name of the book is called The Diary of a Country Priest. And it was written in the late 1930s about a priest in France. Ordinary guy, nobody special, just like you and I, ordained a priest, and he started to live his priesthood for himself. He had the wrong understanding of what it meant. And so he wasted some years of his life as a priest. Became an alcoholic. And when things couldn't get any worse, they got worse. And so finally one day he hit his bottom. And hitting his bottom, he was able, by the grace of God, to sober up. And after he sobered up, and in sobering up, he realized that part of becoming sober was to become responsible. And so he started to live his priesthood for Christ. And he began to do some amazing work. And the people began to love him. And he was very effective as a priest. He was bringing souls to the Lord. And then he got cancer. And he was shocked when he found out that he had cancer, because he couldn't understand why God had allowed him to live all those years wasting his life living for himself, not representing him, but full of himself. And then, when he sobered up and began to do some really, really good work, he gets this terrible, terrible disease. And so he went from shock to try to bargain with God. And you know, God does not enter into collective bargaining. And God does not play tug of war. See, we play those games with ourselves, but God doesn't play those games. And then he got angry. And then he went into denial, back to shock, to acceptance, went through the whole range of human emotions. And so the latter part of the book is about he's dying. And so the last chapter of the book is about his imminent death. And toward the end of the chapter, he's with his best priest friend. And he's dying in his arms. And the last page, the last line of the last page says this. He looks at his friend after looking at his life, and he says, C'est toute la grâce. It's all grace. You see, through the pain and the suffering and the struggle in his life, he'd come to reconcile what it was that God was really asking of him. To lay it all down. To lay it all down. And that's what it took for him. To be able to lay it all down. You see, we have, I think, all of us can agree, none of us wants to suffer, to struggle. We'd all much rather avoid that stuff. And like St. Paul, who was given that thorn in the flesh, he tried to bargain with God too. I could do so much better ministry, Lord, if you just take that thorn away from me. And Jesus' response to that was, my grace is enough for you. You see, because God doesn't allow this pain and struggle and suffering in our lives because he wants to show us who's boss. It's got nothing to do with that. He has a much higher purpose for the pain and the suffering and the struggle that we go through in our lives. Oftentimes, it's through the pain and the suffering and the struggle that we come to a greater appreciation and understanding of what life is really all about. I don't think I'd find very many people this morning who would argue with me that over time our thinking changes. The little ones, they think a particular way. And then the teenagers think different. Young adults mature and they think differently. And so by the time you get into your 30s and 40s and you're putting some mileage on you, so to speak, you've been through the school of hard knocks. And you think differently. You see things differently. You begin to understand and appreciate differently. My dad had to quit school. And he had to go to work to help support the family. Because at the time, my grandmother had 4 sons overseas during the Second World War. And then my dad became of age and he got drafted. So my grandmother had 5 sons overseas. 5 sons. And so my dad came home. One died, one got killed. One lost a hand. And war's hell. War does things. My dad came home, met my mom. Thank God. Met my mom, and they got married, and he began to raise a family. And so my father wanted to teach the children, myself, my sister, my brother, the value and importance of hard work and an education. So what my father did? He went back to night school 4 years to get a high school diploma. He would work all day long, come home, grab a sandwich, and he went to night school for 4 years, 3 nights a week, to get a high school diploma that was never, ever going to do him any more good than to say that he graduated from high school and had a diploma. But it taught me a very, very, very important lesson, that watching my father struggle and my father work hard for that told me the value, taught me the value of that education, of hard work. You see, it's only when we're willing to lay it down. Just like Herb Brooks was trying to get those hockey players to understand, they had to lay their individual stuff down. They had to put it aside. And they began to become a team. And you know, as a team, they did some very incredible and amazing things. They won against odds that were phenomenal. My brothers and sisters, I fear that many Christians today have the wrong understanding of what it means to be Christian, especially many of our politicians who publicly claim that they are pro-choice. They support abortion and then claim to be respectful, practicing Catholics. You can't be both. You can't be both. You got to be willing to lay something down. You got to lay something down. Jesus is very, very, very clear in the gospel this morning that we can have the right answer about who he is, but the wrong understanding of what his purpose is really all about. He rebuked his disciples and says, be careful what you do with those thoughts. They have consequences.